This is our national webinar, Shifting into High Gear, Literacy and the Common Core. A couple of upcoming events to highlight, or actually, I'm sorry, an upcoming event to highlight, an opportunity for you to engage with experts in a collaborative environment. We have a conference, High Impact Literacy Instruction, Shifting into High Gear to Meet the Challenges of the Common Core. We will have David Chard, our guest here today on our webinar, Mary Ellen Vogt, Lisa Siebelak, Juan Cordova, and Jack Umstatter, and that is in beautiful Carlsbad, California on December 10th and 11th of this year. So please check that out. If you'd like to find out more about that event, go to our website, or we'll have some contact information for you again towards the end of the webinar. As mentioned, my name is Tony Flach. I am a National Practice Director with the Services Strategy and Innovation team of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. With us today are David Chard. David is an expert on how children learn, particularly special education students. His research and teaching interests are in the instruction of literacy and mathematics skills for all kids, including those with disabilities. He's a frequent presenter at national and international conferences, has taught courses on behavior management, special education reading and writing. And boy, David, as a former inclusion teacher, I'm eagerly anticipating the things you're going to share with us today.
Great.
Learning disabilities and special education law. He's published more than 50 research articles, co-authored 14 books, including children's textbooks in both math and literacy. And in 2012, President Barack Obama appointed him to serve a 3-year term on the board of directors of the National Board for Education. This 15-member board oversees and directs the work of the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. Also with us today is my friend and colleague Jack Umstatter. I've had the privilege of working with Jack for the past several years now. He is a professional development associate with the Leadership and Learning Center. He's an educator and facilitator from the Long Island, New York area and has taught all grades from kindergarten through graduate school. Served as a high school assistant principal and English department chair, and boy, Jack, as a former English major, you have my sympathy there. Oversaw state assessment scoring in his district and coached several academic teams. Jack's the author of more than a dozen teacher resources in the field of literacy and has written for the History Channel and Newsday and has been included in contemporary authors and who's who among America's teachers. For the past 6 years, he's been a national keynote speaker, a K-12 workshop presenter, a coach consultant, and has designed, implemented, and delivered multiple sessions on a variety of topics and learning strategies. David and Jack, welcome to our session today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you.
All right, folks, and we're going to get going right with some interactivity. We'd like you to respond to the poll question that you see here on the screen. And again, as you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to send those in. But our first question for the day to kick things off: which of the following do you think is the greatest obstacle to your students' success in reading and language arts? And you see your choices there on the screen. And folks, as those are rolling in, you know, David, I'm looking forward to hearing from you because, as I mentioned to you, I was formerly the regular ed side of an inclusion classroom, and I'm thinking about all my friends and colleagues who are still in the classroom and making this transition to Common Core. And thinking about all of the points here on the screen and wondering which of these are going to come up. So very much looking forward to what you have to say. So far, looks like, David, about 48% of our respondents are choosing D as we go. That's ticking up, kind of like watching the election returns. All right. So, David, if you would, please.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Tony, and Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. It's a great opportunity to speak with this audience and talk a little bit about a topic that's particularly important to all of us, and that's children's ability to learn from what they read. That's the most important component of why we do what we do. And the poll results are not at all surprising. I think it's important that in the era of standards-based learning, and more importantly, as we are on the eve of the implementation of the Common Core, I think what we're really interested in is how do we help children learn from what they read more broadly, read more deeply, and be able to write as well. So I wanted to lead off by talking a little bit about what are the big ideas that shape reading comprehension, and that poll actually does capture many of them. because we can't be strategic readers if we can't read the words fluently, understand what the words mean, and then be able to strategize around our reading and be more effective in our reading. So I want to talk a little bit about these big ideas, and specifically 4 of them that I think are important for the listeners to be aware of. And I'll start with the basic building blocks of reading, and that's our ability to automatically and fluently read words in text. And that involves understanding the code and then being able to read text smoothly and be able to understand the kinds of message the author's communicating to us. And there are obstacles along the way, particularly for children with learning disabilities. This automaticity and fluency can be a major obstacle to getting to the strategy of reading that many of the listeners noted was one of the biggest challenges for them. Kind of a second piece of this is background in world knowledge, and I will add into that the academic vocabulary component. And children, by their very nature, do not come to our schools with broad world knowledge, so that's part of what we do in educating them, but also beyond second grade, it's largely built by what they read. So this is why being able to read widely and close to the text is important, because this is where we learn most of what we know about the world around us. The third area is how we engage in that content, and really this is the relationship between students and their peers, between students and the teacher, and between students and the text. It's how we engage in the content, think about it, organize it, reorganize it, write about it, and it's that this is where the close reading piece comes up that Jack will talk about a little bit later in the webinar. And then the third area is really being a strategic reader that many of the listeners mentioned as being key to the challenge that their students have in being successful. If we could go to the next slide. I want to talk a little more specifically about reading fluency because, as I mentioned earlier, this can be a major obstacle for a lot of students. And it is the bridge, fluency is really the bridge between our ability to read and identify the meaning of words and our ability to understand text more broadly. So if you think about fluency as that, the whole reason why we want to focus on children being able to read smoothly and to be able to read with expression is that we're trying to get them to be able to go from individual word meanings to reading text and the sort of understanding what an author is trying to convey in that text, whether it's informational or narrative text. The fluency piece is particularly important. It's also about motivation, because if we do it well, we're more likely to do more of it, and that's true of anything we engage in, any behavior we engage in. So if I'm a successful reader, it's much more likely I'm going to read more. So we want to be sure that as we build proficiency in readers, we build the core skills that they need, the phonemic awareness, the decoding skill, the ability to attend closely to the way text is constructed and to make meaning from that print. We also have to be careful that we don't have readers spending too much time bogged down in text that they can't read, because then they can't make sense of it. And of course, that's demotivating. We just get the opposite effect. So really what we're looking for in reading fluency is the ability to read those words efficiently and effectively and to sound like language, because that's what helps children make sense of what they're reading. The next area, which I mentioned, is this world knowledge piece, has to do with vocabulary. And the research on how well we teach vocabulary is disconcerting at best. So back in 2005, researchers found that in grades 2 and 3, particularly low-income students did about as well as the general population, but as they went beyond that in later grades, they fell further and further behind. This is a reflection both of their not reading enough, but also our not providing sufficient instruction in vocabulary. The second piece of that information, more recent research by Graves and others, is that we aren't yet doing enough to build kind of to bridge that gap in vocabulary for struggling learners. And what's the impact of that, I think, is the real question, and what do we do about it? Yeah, please.
David, you know, as you're describing the literature there, I'm struck by several schools with whom I've had the opportunity to work recently that serve low socioeconomic status students or you know, high percentage of ESL, and the vocabulary
Right.
just really seems to be a challenge for them, even closing the gap in that vocabulary. Any thoughts about that, or where we should go?
Yeah, well, my big thought is preschool education. I realize it's a larger societal issue, but what we know is that language skills that don't develop even before entry to school impact our ability to teach more language once kids are in school. So if we don't start early by kind of making sure children get sufficient language support and exposure, what happens is when we get them in second, third, and fourth grade, we're trying to add language on top of a foundation that's not very strong. So what we know, and I think if you advance to the next slide, I think it's important that people understand that even if we teach minimal vocabulary, it's better than not addressing vocabulary at all. So we can see gains in children's language skills simply by identifying words, pulling words out of text, defining those words for children. And if we can combine definitional vocabulary with a conversation about how it fits into their life, so giving context and examples and being really specific and graphic and showing pictures, what we do is we kind of give them a broader base to add that into their foundation. And again, you know, I think to your question, and this is by no means an easy thing to do, but if we can combine that definitional vocabulary approach to their context, giving them a relationship with that word to their life, it is much more likely that they'll be able to then accrue more knowledge that's related to that word.
Excellent. And folks, please feel free to send in your questions as we go throughout the webinar. And David, thanks for that. That takes us up to
Sure.
our second poll question for the day, ladies and gentlemen. David is talking about interventions and the need to teach vocabulary. And as you think about the transition to either Common Core state standards or new standards, I know Virginia, my neighbor to the north, has changed their standards even though they've not adopted Common Core. Which of these literacy areas present the greatest challenge to your students? Is it reading literature? Is it reading for information? Again, this is an active poll. If you would please select your responses, and don't hesitate to send any other questions that you have for Jack or for David as we go through. But I know my own personal experience here has been yeah, kind of trending right with where the audience is replying. It seems like Jack and David, B so far is our leading response, with 45% of folks responding saying that that's their biggest challenge. And I know in my own daughters, 9 and 13, in school here in North Carolina, they're doing a lot more reading of these kind of texts.
Yeah, there's definitely been a shift in emphasis to increasing informational text in the classroom, and I really think it follows student interest as well. But it's only been the last few years that we've seen a lot of resources available in good informational text for young children in particular.
In addition, Tony, I also see in various classrooms, specifically English language arts classrooms, where many teachers are now combining a literature piece with an informational text. Mm-hmm. So it really is beautiful. Like, we were watching one lesson was about the bombing of Birmingham, the Birmingham church, and what we were doing is reading the poem and also taking a look at some of the first-hand accounts, some of the straight news stories. So it is, informational text is coming in droves now.
As you can see, pretty much the biggest chunk of responses were on B, reading informational text. So, Jack, you know, maybe if you could share some ideas about how we go about teaching that, because I know for both my girls, they're actually, we're really lucky, they're good readers, but they sometimes struggle in reading informational text because it's so different.
Yes, and what it is, it's when we're talking about close reading, Tony, we're really getting into something that is a highly constructive activity. You know, when the teacher and the student is probing for more and more evidence. You know, I hear teachers using the metaphor that it's no longer can we jet ski across a piece, we're now going to be scuba diving. So when we're looking at someone like David who, a great deal of his academic time is spent on research, it's probably wise to take a look at what the experts are saying. And the first excerpt we have here, it's an intensive analysis of a text. That's Dr. Tim Shanahan, and he's the director of the University of Illinois at Chicago Literacy Center. Combining that is another well-known name in research, and that's Dr. Doug Fisher from San Diego. And Doug talks about the careful and purposeful rereading, where we're going back to it, just like we do in literature. We're going to be doing the same in writing. Rewriting in literature, we're rereading. It's thorough and it's methodical, and that's right out of the PARC model framework. So whether you're a smarter balanced state or a PARC state, it is going to be something where, as you alluded to, Tony, your daughters will be going over it methodically, and the teacher will be leading this. Hopefully it'll be the gradual release where those girls and all the other students will be on their own. And then the last quote, where they're mindfully extracting and internalizing, that's Dr. Richard Paul and Dr. Linda Elder, two people whom I respect greatly. They're authorities on critical thinking, and they're really the heart and soul of the foundation and center for critical thinking out in California. And with that in mind, why don't we move on to actually what they propose as one working process when it comes to close reading, as found on the next slide.
Actually, we'll do in just a sec. Jack and David, though, we have a couple of questions that have come in from our audience that kind of cluster together here. One from Ms. Denton. She asks, do you have a list of resources that special ed and ELL teachers can use as we're talking about these areas here?
Specific to informational text or close reading or fluency, what would be the, if we can redirect
let's look
the question,
and see if we, let's see if we get a response on that. So while she's taking a chance to send that in, the next question from Calvin, do you think choral reading for automaticity before attacking close reading is a good strategy?
Well, I actually think Jack's going to talk a little bit about a pre-reading or a pre-close reading methodology. Aren't you, Jack? Isn't that? So you might get to that question.
All right, so Calvin, if you can hold on there. And from Abby, she has a question in regards to vocabulary. She teaches ESL to high school English language learners, beginners. She's struggling to find ways to incorporate both general and academic vocabulary that coincides with the reading. She asks if we have suggestions on where to begin to teach academic vocabulary when most of her students don't know most of the Tier 1 words, and how can you incorporate that and still be working on standards and mastering the standards in the Common Core? Wow, that's a loaded question, Abby.
Go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that you, for high schoolers, you don't have time to not begin teaching academic vocabulary early, even though they may not be fully prepared for all of it. And I think it needs to come from text. So it may be highly simplified text, given that they're starting with such a kind of clean slate in English, and you may be doing kind of building both of them simultaneously. And so I think you have to be mindful of picking a few high importance words out of the academic vocabulary, given that they're going to have such a cognitive load, and give them really clear illustrations of what those things look like, and use them frequently in your own speech, but also encourage them to use the words in theirs. It's anyway.
Jack, any thoughts there? And then we have two others. Actually, I might table the two till your section is completed. So any other thoughts about Abby's question?
Well, I concur with David in that when you're looking at, let's say, the Isabel Beck study and the McEwen study, it's looking at Tier 2 words and how you're really going to get the most bang for your buck, as they say, out of them. And then if we were to overload them with Tier 3 words, and often, it's going to be somewhat detrimental, because often those are the words that are going to be actually defined within the text, whether they're going to be in a highlighted print or found in the marginalia or found in the glossary in the back. So really looking, as David had said, with great frequency, using these words over and over again. The illustrative examples are going to be fine for them. I just imagine ourselves taking on a foreign language. What would be the ones that are most beneficial in terms of just getting good strategies down, but they should be consistent. very consistent strategy so that they're always going to be saying, I can go back to this. This is something that I can now rest my hat on, that I know how to use this particular strategy well. Not a whole melange of them, just selected few that have high results, Tony.
Excellent. Thanks, gentlemen. And Jan, LaShare, and Diane, I will not forget your questions. We'll interject those in just a little bit. But Jack, I think you're getting ready to tell us about a closed reading process.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Well, folks, as we look at this five-step process, let's keep in mind that although, as you can see at the bottom where we give credit to Doctors Paul and Elder out of the California Critical Research, that this is just one format. There is not something where it's engraved in granite and has to be that way. You have to look into the eyes of your students, know what it is that they think or that you think they need, and move on from there. So what I've selected here is their pattern. Now, it's interesting when you look at the title of the book, it says how to read a paragraph. Well, the thinking is if you can read the paragraph, you're going to be doing the same as you start to move on to larger texts. Now, there are different options. There are those teachers who like, and this was the question Calvin asked, where it will be a choral reading. There are other teachers who say, and this is something that you could find folks on Engage NY, where David Coleman, one of the constructors of the Common Core ELA standards, engageny.org is the website, and he goes over close reading as it applies to the Gettysburg Address and Letter from Birmingham Jail. There are great videos that you might benefit from looking at that particular site, but what Coleman says is there are times when you're just going to drop them into the text. Let them kind of like see what's in there for themselves. So again, you don't want to overload the cart with, oh, it's going to be too much for them, but at the same time, we have to give them those gradual release forms. So as we're looking here, the first is it's very important that we number the lines, or maybe number the paragraphs. Somehow we have to chunk that particular text, because it could be, looking at the Puritan literature that many sophomores in our country read. It's long, sentences that have more than 70 words in them. So now we have to chunk and then start to annotate. On paraphrasing, it is going to increase the student's vocabulary as well. So they're getting the essential meaning of that particular text and increasing vocabulary. I know something very important in David's studies. Number two, this, of course, is going to be relating to the Common Core State Standard number 8. And that is going to be where stating what's the author's claim or thesis. We can still use thesis, but the Common Core is asking us to use the word claim. We're separating here the wheat from the chaff. Looking at our third step, according to Paul and Elder, what is the author's purpose? And of course, we're looking here, folks, mostly, it seems, in informational text. Because in this one here, with standard number 6, the point of view or purpose is going to shape the content and style of the text, just giving the kids a little Garmin, the GPS, as to what type of writing this is and what can I be looking for. And then moving over, and this really, of course, we know that number 8 is a standard in the informational text, but it's not necessarily a standard that we're going to see in the other, and that would be is the validity of the reasoning, the relevance, the sufficiency. But let's apply that into literature. We're looking there at, how well does the author know his or her subject? Patricia Polacco in Thank You, Mr. Falker, knew what it was like to be unable to read, knew what it was like to be harassed by her classmates. Harper Lee, I think she was, something like 35 years old when she wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, obviously knew the mores, the cultures of the South. And then the great example, of course, is Arthur Miller at 34 to really have such a grasp on the world of business. But I like to think of that, folks, as the assessing the text would be to what extent am I convinced of his purpose or her purpose in writing this. And number 5 is fun for the kids. It's a lot of role playing where one student takes on the role of the author, the other could be a questioner, that might be a critic, it could be a character stepping out of the text and going over, asking them as a newspaper, let's say, op-ed writer, what are some of the things you did here? Tell me about your style. Okay, so again, let's not say that this is the only method, but it is one that really is an intense part of getting kids fully immersed in the text and looking for that particular evidence.
So, Jack, as we're getting ready to transition into some before, during, and after reading strategies, a couple more questions have come in for you and David, kind of related here. And I think, there's several questions related to resources, so perhaps we might be able to get a list together of resources at the conclusion of the webinar. And folks, those that are asking about resources, please feel free to email us and we'll follow up on that. But Jan asked a question: do students find this demotivating, this closed reading process that we're describing?
David, you want to handle that one first?
Well, I actually think the answer is dependent on the careful selection of what it is you're reading closely. If you select pieces that are substantive and important and that they're going to learn from, then the answer would be no. And there are those kids, particularly on the younger side, who want to race through everything. Yes, you have to convince them that they have to slow down, and you kind of reward that behavior. But I think if they learn something new along the way, new words, new ideas, it doesn't have to be demotivating.
No. And just going back to what the Common Core folks are asking us to read, and that would be, make sure it's Shakespeare, myths and folk tales around the world, looking at seminal American documents. I mean, those, as David mentioned, they are very rich. I guess you'd have to almost take, and I don't mean to be anything other than realistic here, a pulse check or a glazed over eyes check to see.
Deer in the headlights look, yeah.
That's it, Tony. To see how much, because there are some who might say, well, I would like to spend 6 days on this one piece. Now, I don't know exactly how many parts of the piece they're going to do, but if we quickly do the math, 6 days over 180 days of school, we're now looking at what, over 3% of the year. But if that is a rich text, and if that can teach many of those different Common Core standards, then it's probably worth going into. But again, we have to remember our clients. Are they getting it? What can I do to better this experience for them?
See, Jack, I think you hit something real key there. The fact that we can teach so many of these standards at once. I know in my own classroom, I often felt it was kind of a check. I did that. Now I got to move on to this, and realizing that I could get so many standards out of one good piece of literature was, very grateful to the person that turned me on to that.
Yes.
We have some additional questions here. Lachère, who was asking about ELLs before and resources. So Lachère, I know where you're from. You mentioned the SOLs. That means you're from my neighbor to the north here, Virginia. One of the most unfortunate acronyms, folks, in state testing history, the Standards of Learning Assessment. However, she's talking about the fact that most of her ELL students are level 3 in high school, and that 40% of her students are ELL level 3 or higher, and expected to pass those SOLs. Any thoughts there? These vocabulary and closed reading pieces, are those things that she really should concentrate on to improve her students' chances?
Yes, the answer is yes. I think, the reality here is that many of these students are going to be challenged by it, but that we have to continue to work hard to give them those opportunities to work with small amounts of text and to really understand. But again, it's a lot about what you select to do the close reading with, and if it's also packed with some really good tier 2 words, I think it can take kids a long way.
And two related questions here. How often do you recommend repeated readings to improve fluency, and will listening to a selection help students with comprehension? Actually, maybe not as related as I thought when I first glanced at them. Sorry, guys.
Well, I can answer the first one quickly. Repeated reading depends on the needs of the learner. So if they're kind of hitting age-appropriate benchmarks, I wouldn't repeatedly read as much as I would want them to read more. If they're lagging behind those expectations, then some repeated reading, even daily, as long as it's small amounts, we don't want to waste a lot of time with repeated reading.
Cool. And second question then, Jack, I'll toss that over to you. Will listening to a selection help students with comprehension?
Absolutely, and that's why there are those advocates who are saying that I would like to have the teacher read it to increase the fluency, to increase the word recognition, and just to increase the comfort level of the students listening into that piece. The key there is picking that piece that is going to be, again, giving us a lot of return on our investment. So is it going to be something that is of high interest to the students? Is it something that's going to benefit them? Very much, Tony, what we do as we start to prioritize the standards. You know, what will help us in school, what will help us in life, what will help us endure in terms of reading. So I think there is great benefit that can be derived from reading that particular piece to the students. Hello?
Did we lose Tony?
Sorry, I hit the mute button. Guys got me now. I muted myself. So
As long as you didn't mute me, Tony.
I'd never do that to you, Jack. Calvin asks, when assessing the author's writing, how important is it to connect back to the theme? And is it more important to connect to main idea? Is it more important to connect from main ideas to big ideas to the theme?
Okay.
I'm not sure I understand.
So let's go back to the first one. When assessing the author's writing, how important is it to connect back to theme?
Oh.
Sorry.
Assessing the author's writing to determine whether it's a good selection to focus on?
I think that was related to step 4 that Jack was talking about in the closed reading process.
I'll let you take that one then.
Well, I would say to Calvin and the others, there are many reasons why, or many different things we're doing as we assess the text, because it's certainly theme is going to be one of them, but it's also going to be, you know, am I convinced that this is, let's say, as drastic a situation as the writer is portraying, or is this kind of nirvana as the writer is portraying? How clear is he or she in the description of it? You know, I'm thinking someone like James Michener had to do extensive research to write about all the different places that he wrote about Hawaii and so forth. But theme is certainly one. It's probably one of the more challenging ones to teach as an English teacher, but you're also looking at all the other elements that go into it. You know, how well did he start or she start the piece? Was this a conflict that's believable? Was the ending something that's believable? So there are many elements to it, but, you know, keep on banging away at the theme, because that is something that I found as a teacher children had tough time grasping.
Excellent.
Well, we continue to struggle with it as adults, right? I mean, this is not, it's not a, you don't master theme, you get better at it over time, I think. With the
that's a great point, David. Thanks for reassuring me personally there. All right, Jack, so you were going to talk to us about some before, during, and after reading ideas.
Good, and what we can do, Tony, is we can, you know, I'm going to kind of very quickly go through these, but when you're starting to look at what goes on inside the head of the reader, in the mind of the reader, and, you know, then conjoining that with Hattie's study from Visible Learning for Teachers, the importance of actually sustained, focused efforts with strategies, whether it's Grant Wiggins or Jay Matthews reporting on a school down in Washington or the Gates Foundation, they all point to keeping the structure, keeping the strategies consistent. And so here are just some ideas that teachers have come through and research supports, you know, setting a purpose. To what extent does the teacher need to support his or her readers? Looking at disciplinary literacy. You know, how important is it that we read as a historian, read as a scientist, read as a mathematician? You know, we all now have that Sherlock Holmes deerstalker hat that on the first visor in the front it says content teacher, and on the back it says reading in the content areas teacher. You know, we're all now going to be responsible as we have in the past, but there's more of an emphasis now. Many of us, and please, I was probably this way in high school, and you know, we don't really look at what's offered to us on the marginalia. What are some of those text features? And then this is a point that I know David's going to address about, you know, vocabulary, but you know, there are those studies that say do not give the kids just list and expect them that they're going to majestically and magnificently just study it and come back to it. Is it Marzano that comes back and says, you know, use it 6 different ways? And, you know, Miller's law states that we can really remember probably about 5 to 6 words. That's why it's probably not advisable a list of 20. We're stretching it, giving them a list of 10. But as David said earlier, studying it and using it with frequency.
All right, Deering.
All right. Okay. And again, you know, if we had a camera inside, Tony, these are the things that we're doing as readers. unfortunately, the poor readers, they kind of, well, you know this, we're struggling to get from the first to the last word, and it's almost breathless by the time we get to that last word. But, you know, kind of slowing down, you're moving too fast, as the song says, you know, doing these various things with starting to look at the toughest one, and, you know, David would probably speak to this well, and I'll ask him to actually chime in here. What would be a good way to teach inference? Because teachers are saying that's a struggle.
Yeah, reading between the lines.
Yeah, so again, you know, the issue with inference is that we never master it, right? We get better and better because we have to understand ourselves, and we have to take text and use what we know and combine that with what we are learning from the reader. From the author, and that's what builds our world knowledge. So this comes through reading widely, reading a lot, and actually discussing it with people. This
Justifying.
this is why people like to talk to one another about what they read, is because it helps us build those inferences. It is not a pretty process, let me tell you. It requires time and attention.
I saw one teacher, David. It was interesting. It was about a 7th grade class, I think, that I was observing, and she came in with hands on hip and really, you know, furrowed brow and looking down at the kids. And the kids say, you know, Miss So-and-so, why are you angry? Well, that was the first step of teaching them inference. You know, these different clues that are there. She wasn't at all angry. She was, you know, it was an effective lesson plan.
Yeah.
But, you know, as we start to look, and, you know, probably second to inference in terms of challenge is synthesizing, and that is just putting all of this information together. And just on the last two, I love when I see teachers actually doing think-alouds. You know, what is the process that the teacher is going through? The teacher is not saying, I walk on water when it comes to reading. I struggle with my own readings, you know, these kinds of things. And the kids appreciate that. And then, of course, looking at text-dependent questions, this is the heart and soul of what we're doing. It's wonderful to make the text-to-world connections and the text-to-self, but there are, when it comes to close reading, it's really coming in with that magnifying glass and looking what's in the text. What does it say? How can this now be brought into a question? And this is where Bloom's higher level taxonomies come in. You know, changing the what to the how, changing the when to the why, all those questions. I'm not saying we don't need those earlier parts, but getting the higher level questions will get the kids up to snuff when it comes to this. And then again, these are different things. I love all the R's in the beginning, where you reread, you remember, you reflect. And the third one goes right along with the Cornell notes. You know, we're going to now write that summary. As we know, Cornell notes are very effective. Work for the Ivy League kids up there in Ithaca. And then as we're looking at our exit slips, there's a wonderful way for teachers to find, is my lesson or has my lesson been effective? If so, why so? If not, why not? And that will now inform the instruction for the following day. And how you're going to assess them on the exit slips, please, again, folks, there's not this, this is the only way we do it. There are many different ways. Okay, thanks.
So, good question here, Jack. You know, it seems to me that these are kind of straightforward ideas, and so is it about doing these things all the time, like you said, with good text? And you and David both talked about quality literature, quality informational text, and just do these things all the time rather than coming up with a kind of a complex monitoring system?
Right. I mean, the research behind this, and of course we at the Leadership and Learning love the research, and these are tried and true, rather than trying, and you know, it's an overused expression, but to reinvent the wheel. The key, Tony, becomes when is this where now the students don't need this, and that's where the experienced teacher has it over the younger one, because you know, we all remember as our neophytes in the classroom, it was tough to know, you know, when to hold them, when to fold them. But the experienced teacher now knows these things work, even though they might be, you know, years old. It's not that the Common Core is saying, hey, you got to go out and find all these different strategies. It is now helping the kids to almost, if you would, unveil, or you know, the wizard is now going to be exposed, because everyone can do this, but you need to show the methods, the strategies, the literacy actions of how to get there.
Can I just
absolutely
ask kind of confirm what Jack's saying, and say you might, as a teacher, think about students reading on two different tracks. One track, they're reading, they're self-selecting readings, they're being assigned readings that are sort of briefer, maybe to inform, but there's less of the engagement around those texts. And then there's a track of text that the theme for the teacher to think about as he or she engineers the selection of these, it's about less is more. Reading fewer texts, but reading them more closely, engaging in the content differently, reorganizing it, summarizing it. Because I think sometimes we think, well, I'm hearing two different things. I'm hearing read broadly, and at the same time read closely. And I think it really requires both. So that may be a way for people to organize that in their head.
So no one text is all things to all people.
No, and in fact, to get to inferencing really takes a great deal of all of the other strategies that Jack mentioned, because inferencing, in my mind, sort of sits at the top of the mountain that we're trying to get kids to ascend.
And gentlemen, we have just a few minutes left. I know folks have very busy schedules and we want to honor their time. So if you could maybe kind of close our time out with ideas for, like I said, I was the regular ed side of an inclusion classroom, so this is what I've been waiting for.
Well, the great thing is we're getting more and more research about students with reading disabilities, and we know that they're able to comprehend well once they get past some of the core phonological difficulties they have with reading text. So this is a study that was published just a year and a half ago or so, and in particular, this is Frankel and David Pearson from Berkeley and colleagues, and I think the important takeaway here is that not all kids have phonological difficulties and difficulties with decoding. Some are going to struggle with comprehension, particularly students with low language or if they're transitioning from one language to another. But everybody needs that center box for sure, which is the comprehension piece. Whether they're having difficulties or not, comprehension grows in kind of an expertise model. We keep getting better and better at it the more we read and the more we engage in the content. Decoding is a mastery task. And so keeping those two things separately and knowing that all students are going to need help with the comprehension piece, I think, is the most important takeaway here.
Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. And ladies and gentlemen, I know there are more questions. LaShare, I, as promised, will forward your question regarding content area vocabulary over to our presenters today. But please take the opportunity, if you're able, to join our two presenters today, David and Jack, in Carlsbad, California, the 10th and 13th, along with several other of our colleagues from the Leadership and Learning Center, Jack's colleagues from the Leadership and Learning Center. Other questions beyond today, please don't hesitate as you're kind of closing out. What other topics would you like to see in future webinars? And as folks are closing out, I'll put our contact information up. Should you like to find out any more about our conferences or other events, please contact Kyle Helfrich there, or direct your questions to the email addresses there that you see on the screen. Folks, please, if you would join me in thanking David and Jack for lending us their expertise this afternoon. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having a conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
All right, and thanks again to Kathy. We're getting some applause from the audience there, folks. Nice job, gentlemen. And Kathy, thank you, as always, for your support in the background. Ladies and gentlemen, within 48 hours, approximately 48 hours, this will be available on our website, www.leadandlearn.com, in the Resource Center. Thank you again, and we look forward to speaking with you in the future. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye.